Well, good morning and welcome to the release of the latest Atlantic Council strategy paper, Silk Road 2.0, U.S. Strategy Towards China's Belt and Road Initiative by Dr. Luft, co-director of the Institute for the Analysis of Global Security. I'm Matt Burrows, the director of the the Foresight Strategy and Risks Initiative here at the Atlantic Council's Brent Scowcroft Center for International Security. This is the 11th publication in our Atlantic Council strategy paper series, following our 6 functional strategies and 4 regional strategy papers released over the past year. To paraphrase what Dr. Joe Nye says in the foreword of Silk Road 2.0, it demonstrates that the futures of both China and the U.S. must be navigated with foresight and care. Through his strategy of constructive participation, Gal illustrates how the U.S. can acknowledge and cooperate with China while also balancing geostrategic and political tensions. The Atlantic Council Strategy Paper Series is designed to enrich public debate and build consensus around the greatest strategic challenges of our time. With President Trump's trip to Asia less than a month away, we at the Council thought it was appropriate to look anew at the most important areas of engagement in the region and outline new strategies to deal with the challenges and opportunities presented by China's Belt and Road Initiative. I want to thank President and CEO Fred Kemp and Dr. Alexander Murchoff for their support of the Atlantic Council strategy papers. They are the executive editors of the series and the driving force behind the effort. I also want to thank Barry Pavel, the Scowcroft Center's director, and all the BSC team for their work on this effort. It really is what makes any report, brings any report to a publication state. With that, I turn it over to Barry, who can introduce the speakers and also get us started on the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. Well, good morning. I'm Barry Pavel. As Matt mentioned, I'm the director of the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security, and I'm really excited about today's discussion. I'm going to try not to talk a lot so we can get to the real meat, but this is a really important issue that is extremely underplayed in Washington, and I think that's a real understatement. Joining me on stage, you have their very impressive biographies, so I won't go into it in detail, but we have Ambassador C. Boyden Gray next to me, former U.S. Ambassador to the European Union and Special Envoy for Eurasian Energy Diplomacy and EU Affairs, as well as a founding partner of Boyden Gray and Associates. Next to him, we have the Atlantic Council's own Ambassador John Herbst. He is former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine and Uzbekistan, and is currently the director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. And next to him is Dr. Miyeon Oh, who is a senior fellow with the Asia Initiative in the Brent Scowcroft Center and is leading the Council's rapidly advancing efforts to establish another center focused on the Asia-Pacific region. And the discussion today is dead center in the mission of that new effort. Lastly, but certainly not least, we are joined by the paper's author, Gal Luft, via Skype from Lugano, Switzerland, which sounds like a very nice place, and I would prefer to be with Gal. But good afternoon, Gal, and thanks very much for joining us. Matt mentioned that the Atlantic Council Strategy Papers is one of our real flagship series, and I think this is a time when strategy, not just policies and responses, this is a time when strategy is very much needed in a very turbulent global landscape. Before I begin, I also wanted to note that the Atlantic Council will release its next strategy paper 1 year in the making on October 19th. And that will be a very novel strategy, I think, than you've seen before on the Asia-Pacific region, again, foreshadowing the President's trip in many ways. I also want to note for this event that it is on the record and is being webcast live. You can join the conversation on Twitter following the account at AC Scowcroft and the hashtag AC Strategy. Please also help us to build the word cloud that you see over there by going to menti.com, menti.com, and entering the code 261488. The code is 261488. And you see the very simple question that is being asked, and I will gear some questions for the panel based on the word cloud as it develops. Now to the topic at hand. The absence of both public discussion and U.S. policy on one of the most ambitious and potentially impactful initiatives by a nation state in modern history has been absolutely striking to us. And so the purpose of today's event, which really is the first of more to come under this initiative, is to help fill that vacuum and help guide the United States and its allies and partners to develop a policy and pursue a strategy that avoids what I think is our current approach, which I would call strategic patience, and only strategic patience. That said, there's a very important role not just for the U.S. government, but for private sector actors as well, which I hope is part of this discussion. But the United States and its allies and partners in both Europe and Asia absolutely have to play in this field, and they need to do so strategically, as it's a question not really of infrastructure or investments or even economics. This is a question of geopolitical order and who will play major roles in the 21st century. I thought Joe Nye's foreword, which I would strongly commend you reading in the strategy paper, was really well structured. And in particular, I think part of what we should discuss today is his point that China follows the Mackinder strategy of trying to really emphasize the Eurasian continent, whereas perhaps the U.S. mindset is more focused on maritime and Alfred Thayer Mahan, and that's why I'm saying this is really a geopolitical question. Let me now turn to Gal. Gal, first, congratulations on a really excellent paper, and I'd like to start things off by giving you the opportunity to walk us through very briefly the 5 pillars of your strategy, which I think you called constructive participation. And Gal, as you do so, I would really welcome your thoughts on what are the costs and risks if the United States continues its current approach.
Thank you, Barry. I hope that you can hear me well. And thank you, all the Atlantic Council, for exercising strategic patience with me, accommodating all my travel considerations. But I'm glad we can do it before the presidential trip to Asia, because I think it's an opportunity of this administration to send a clear message to the Asian leaders about where the United States stands with regards to Asia. He will meet not only with leaders of China, Japan, and South Korea, but also participate in the APEC summit and the ASEAN summit. So we'll have to, in 12 days, he will basically see everyone, and he will get the best opportunity to describe how does he see America's role in Asia. For me, I became attached to this issue for 3 reasons. One is because I think that when you talk to people in Asia about what bothers them, what they're concerned about, most of them would not point out to the South China Sea or even to North Korea as the issues that they care most about. But most of them are bothered by the biggest problem, in my view, in Asia, which is poverty. Asia, developing Asia, is very poor. We have more than 2 billion people that don't have access to electricity, internet, transportation, communication, etc. And that really undermines global growth at a time that we need global growth, at a time that we are looking for growth engines. So I think that's something that China understood and decided to do something about it. But the administration has not really responded to the problem. sorry. The administration has not responded. Not only the Trump administration, but the Obama administration, which was completely mute about the issue. Not only that they did not acknowledge the initiative, they even tried to undermine it when it comes to the participation in the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. They even lobbied against lobbied other countries against joining the initiative. The other issue that I think is very important to understand is that U.S.-China relations need more areas of cooperation. I mean, most of our conversation with China is about North Korea, is about South China Sea, and is about trade. But none of those issues are resolvable, really. I mean, if you really want to be honest with ourselves, those issues can at best be managed. They're not issues that lend themselves to major growth and progress. So I thought that broadening the relations, including more areas where we can have win-win solutions, for example, infrastructure, poverty alleviation, how to stimulate growth, etc. The third issue that I wanted to mention here is the issue of trade, because so much is being discussed about trade. And I believe that this administration is not going to advance trade in the traditional sense of the word. When we talk about trade, we normally mean trade paper or paper trade. In other words, treaties, trade agreements, etc. Clearly, we're probably not going to see a lot of progress in the coming years on this. But where we can see progress when it comes to trade is to increase what I call the trade nodes, the number of trade nodes, the ports, the roads, all these infrastructures that facilitate trade. So if you have more infrastructure that enables trade to happen, you have more trade. If you have more people connected to internet, you can have more e-commerce, etc. So I think that we have an opportunity to redefine trade here and to talk about trade under different terms. My premise is this, and before I go to the strategy, I have to explain my premise. My premise is that this initiative cannot be looked upon purely through a geopolitical lens. If we look at everything through a geopolitical lens, we miss the big picture. We have to also look at things through a geoeconomic lens and somehow integrate the two. From a geopolitical perspective, clearly there are problems, and I think Secretary Mattis pointed out yesterday his concerns about one of the elements of the Belt and Road. We don't have to agree to everything, every component of the Belt and Road. And certainly we can discuss with internally what we like, what we don't like. We don't have to buy into the whole package. That's why I called it constructive participation. We don't need to buy it all or reject everything. But I think that we need to understand that this initiative, while it's very good for China, and don't mistake here, because China is doing it because it's good for China, because China needs jobs, China needs projects, China needs stimulation of the economy. They're doing it because it's good for them. The question is what's good for them bad for us? Or maybe what's good for them could be also good for us. And my argument is that we can benefit, America can benefit a lot from this Belt and Road. Why? Think about it. If you're GE or Honeywell or Bechtel or any of those companies that are in the field of manufacturing and infrastructure, look at how many projects you can now participate in. New projects. If you are Facebook or Amazon or Google, and 80% of the people in developing Asia have no access to internet, and now you bring all these people into the world of internet, how many new users those companies can win? So you can go down this road. Energy. What does it mean for American energy companies now that they can have more infrastructure for trade of energy, pipelines, more terminals, etc.? So American companies can benefit. American defense companies, American cyber companies, all of those companies can make a lot of money because of this initiative if they become players in this, if they have an opportunity to compete. If we're not in, we are losing. Second point I want to make, you have to consider the cost of failure of this initiative. And I would argue here, China is rolling a huge dice here. It is making the biggest gamble of the century because it is risking trillions of dollars of its own money in something that may succeed, but it also may not succeed. Now, if it succeeds, then we can discuss what happens if it succeeds. But what happens if it doesn't succeed? If it doesn't succeed, China will face catastrophic financial result out of this, and that will hurt us because we have a $20 trillion debt, and this 20 trillion is going to 30 trillion in 10 years. We are increasing our debt obligations by $1 trillion a year for the foreseeable future. And we are relying on China to finance our debt to a certain extent. It is our number one debt holder, $1.2 trillion to be exact. And we are hoping that in the next 10 years, they will almost double their debt obligation, debt holding. Well, if they're rich, if they're doing well, maybe they will, maybe won't. But certainly, if the Belt and Road is not successful, you can forget about it. They will not double their debt holding, and that will have a catastrophic impact on the US economy. So we have to realize that the stakes are very, very high. And with this, I would say, without getting into every detail of the strategy, first and foremost, engage. Engage, examine, study, look deep into it. Look not only from a geopolitical perspective, but also from a geoeconomic perspective. Have an internal process within the administration and within the Congress to assess, is it good, is it bad, what's good, what's bad, what can we support, what we cannot support, etc., etc. So we need to have an internal process within our government. Number one. Number two, we need to have red lines. What we don't like, we have to talk to the Chinese. And how do we talk to the Chinese? We have official dialogue with the Chinese. There are 4 tracks, was established by Xi Jinping and Donald Trump in Florida. First round already took place. To the best of my understanding, Belt and Road was not discussed there. But we have channels, we have ways to dialogue with the Chinese, and we have to discuss what we like and what we don't like, and to try to explain to them our priorities, especially on areas that are disputed areas like Kashmir, like South China Sea. Those are areas that we want to make sure that this Belt and Road is not used as a pretext to change the status quo in areas of the world where are quite sensitive geopolitically. Then we have to talk about what is the role of the United States in all of this, if any. So we can be cheerleaders, but if we are serious, we need to find out what can be our role. For example, AIIB. So far, we rejected it, but I think we need to take a new look at the AIIB and to be a little bit more open-minded about it, simply because AIIB, most of its projects are done in conjunction with World Bank and Asia Development Bank. They're not investing alone, they are co-investing with existing multilateral development banks. So I think we need to take a new look at it. Even Canada joined the AIIB. I'm not saying that the US needs to join the AIIB, but it could be an observer. But at the very least, let's take a new look at it. We can also find ways to work with the Chinese on infrastructure projects. And I particularly want to talk about the Middle East, because I think that the Middle East is now destroyed. Okay, but in a few years, in the coming years, what we'll see is the biggest reconstruction project in history since the Second World War, I think. Because you're going to have to rebuild Libya, you're going to have to rebuild Yemen, you're going to have to rebuild Syria, you're going to have to rebuild Iraq and Afghanistan. These are all major reconstruction efforts. And we need to begin to arrange ourselves with partners and to begin to think, how do we take these countries, once the dust settles, once the political situation clarifies and improves, but from that moment there has to be expeditious reconstruction to bring those countries and those societies that have been in a chaotic situation since 2011, and in the case of Iraq even before, and to bring them back into normalcy. We also need to think about the role of what does it mean for the U.S. to be in the development business. You know, we don't have a development strategy today, and I would never argue that we should sort of outsource international development to the Chinese. I don't think it's a good idea that we sort of let the Chinese own the international development agenda. But if we don't come up with our own red, white, and blue agenda for development, then obviously we'll see more and more countries turning to the Chinese to do it. And so we need to be present there. And I think that all of these together mean that we have to decide that we have a responsibility in developing Asia. It doesn't mean that you have to bring in taxpayers' money to this. I would never argue for something like this. But I think that we have private sector. There is well over $1 trillion in private equity funds that is looking at investment opportunities. But they are looking for signals from our government. And if the government is skeptical about the Belt and Road, this money will not go into those kind of investments. So there's all kind of things, all kind of signals that we can send that can allow us to be to get other countries to assess their views. Japan, Korea, India. India is very important because India, on the one hand, it is concerned about the Belt and Road for the right reasons, but also India could be a major beneficiary, as I pointed out in the report, because certain elements of the Belt and Road really help India to get over its very, very severe poverty problem. So it's a mixed bag. And to summarize, I would say that we have to have a nuanced approach towards the Belt and Road, and to look at it component by component, and also not to look at the Belt and Road as a bunch of lines on the map. This is a dynamic program that could be changed, could be reprioritized, and it all depends on whether we are part of it or we let the Chinese run the show. And I would say, if you can't beat it, join it. Thank you.
Great, Gal. Thanks very much for your summary of your strategy. And now I want to engage some of our other panelists, and I'll turn to Ambassador Gray and just say something that Gal said I think makes a lot of sense. He said, quote unquote, first and foremost, engage. And so how should the United States in particular engage with Europe about China's initiative and with China? I mean, I think that sort of geometry is really important and certainly central to help advance and protect U.S. interests. So I'd love your thoughts on the Europe aspect of this initiative and Gal's approach.
Yes, well, our gateway into, major gateway into this whole project may be through Europe. And let me just say by way of starting that I don't know how many of you have read a new book called Silk Roads. It's by an Oxford professor whose name I cannot pronounce. But it's fascinating. It's a page turner. It shows that this issue of this part of the world reached deep into Europe, for example, and deep into China on both ends 2,000 years ago. So I would encourage all of you to read this book if you want to get a 2,000-year preview of what this may mean to today. So where does Europe come in? Well, as Gal's paper points out, it's a two-edged sword. We're probably happy that China will be helping Europe increase its economic growth. On the other hand, the price that may be paid for that is that China and Europe will end up teaming up and setting the standards for everything that is commercial, from digital activity to cars to energy, you name it. And if we get left out of that, we could find ourselves really in a backwater. So it is, to me, terribly important to restart talks with Europe about how standards are set for every facet of commercial trade activity, including rules about the trading rules themselves. And I think that will get us into a discussion very, very quickly with the Chinese and how they plan to participate in the setting of standards. I just close these initial remarks by saying that I've read that as this project unfolds, the more China gets into the more developed countries, the more difficulties it has getting through the regulatory hurdles of permitting and controls and limits and guardrails. This is something which is undergoing some revision in the United States, thank God, but it can take years to get a permit just to do anything, build a road, fix a bridge, whatever. And the Chinese are going to have trouble with this permitting process, which is pervasive across the developed world, and that is another entry point for us to get involved. But I just repeat, if we can't do this together with Europe, Europe is going to do it together with China.
Very important point, Boyden, and it reminds me of the same thing playing out in Asia, where TPP was going to set the standards. Now standards are being set in other venues, and it's incumbent upon the United States to play in those venues as well. So I'm sure we'll get to that. Let me turn now to Ambassador Herbst, and John, would love to hear your thoughts. In particular, you spent a lot of time in Central Asia, including when you were ambassador there, and you also spent a lot of time now on Russia and the challenges and opportunities that it presents. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on those two angles.
I'm happy to do that, Barry, but to do it, I have to provide a little bit of a geopolitical framework. It was great that you quoted Joe Nye referring to Mahan and Mackinder, because Mackinder said that to control, basically, if you want to be the most powerful nation on earth, you have to control the world island, meaning Eurasia. And China's orientation has often followed a Mackinder-type perspective. And Mahan said, no, the key to world power is control of the seas. And that has been something the United States has seen as a guiding star. But the interesting thing about China today, the really interesting thing about China today, is that a result of its dynamism, it is pursuing both a land and a sea strategy. You know, the great Chinese treasure fleet that visited East Africa in the early 15th century was disbanded by the Ming because they decided to move into Central Asia. Great book by a political scientist at MIT, China Marches West, talks about this. What we're seeing today, though, and this Silk Road Initiative makes it very clear, is that they're expanding both across Eurasia on land and by sea route. And they're doing that because they have the ability to do it, because they have this incredible economic dynamism. Now, why am I telling you this in answer to your question? Because this is a direct threat to Russian interest. They have traditionally been a land power. They've been at the center of the world island. In fact, Mackinder said that the key to controlling the world island was controlling Eastern Europe, Russian territory. This is a direct threat to Russian historic interests and to Putin's own agenda, but a threat that Moscow recognizes, but only latently, because of their strategic engagement to their great cost in Ukraine and in Eastern Europe. There are strategic thinkers in Moscow who understand this, but they're not calling the shots. And in fact, for Russia to react correctly to the growing Chinese presence in their neighborhood, especially in Central Asia, they'd have to come to a rapprochement with the United States. This will come. This will come, certainly within the next generation, but maybe sooner than that. Because there are now signs in the wind, not much more than that, that people in Moscow are reconsidering their not so excellent Ukrainian adventure. As for Central Asia, the Central Asians, up until very recently, saw China as a hedge against Russia's traditional dominance in the region, even as they recognize the potential danger of a Chinese hegemon. They, of course, all welcome the economic prospects that come with the Silk Road project, but they remain concerned about being able to manage Chinese influence in their countries. Their ability to do this will be enhanced once Moscow comes to its strategic senses. But at this point, that's not what's happening.
Thanks very much, John. And I think we want to engage on some of the issues you raise in the discussion, and certainly not too early for those in the audience. If you have questions, start to think of those, and we'll come to you in a few minutes. Now I wanted to turn to Dr. Oh. She's an expert on many of the issues being discussed here, and in particular ask her, what started this? Why do you think China got stimulated to embark on this very ambitious endeavor? And then you're an energy expert in particular, and since energy is sort of the lifeblood of the global economy, and I think Gal's paper pays some attention to this, I would love your views on the energy aspect of this as well.
Thank you, Barry. I would like to briefly describe what triggered this BRI, and which is related to Ambassador Herb you just explained. And there are two major global events, one global financial crisis and pivot to Asia that the Obama administration announced had a profound impact on Chinese elite mindset and for its ongoing assessment of their country's economic development prospects and external strategic environment. In the wake of the financial crisis, global economy started to push global economy, including China, entered a period of slow growth, and China was able to recover briefly with the stimulus package, but then the double-digit economic growth rate is not possible. And then in 2011, Obama administration started to push for the establishment of TPP, which we discussed before, and which was seen in Beijing as a way to expand U.S. access in Asia while marginalizing China. So Chinese authorities concluded that relying on a conventional approach to achieve China's rise was no longer sufficient and had to think strategically turn these challenges into opportunities. And I thought that this would help us to what this triggered this strategic initiative and what are the logic behind this initiative. And as Barry asked, I would like to spend time on talking about energy. And one important point that we would have to know is that China became a net oil energy exporter since 1993. And since then, energy security has become a very important factor because almost 2/3 of its oil import had to come through all the maritime choke points, including the Malacca Strait and South China Sea. So diversifying the lines of supply and transportation route has been very important in Chinese domestic policy as well as foreign policy. So and then with this idea of BRI came up in 2013, and there's a trend that there's no significant changes in terms of the financial number and in terms of energy investment related to BRI, but we have to really note that why this is really strategically important to China. As I mentioned, this Malacca dilemma that China is dealing with, and so China has been trying to develop a lot of overland pipelines, such as oil and natural gas pipelines, coming from Central Asia and coming from Myanmar and coming from Russia, and which are all impacting very geopolitical dynamics all over the globe. And I would like to mention about the China-Pakistan economic corridor, and which Gal also spent a lot of time in the report. And with Pakistan, there was a $330 billion investment solely on energy, and Xinjiang is a large coal producer, but is suffering from excess capacity, and this lending new export opportunities. And so China is trying to ship oil from the Middle East to China control the deep water port of Gwadar in Pakistan, and then carrying it to by road, railway, and pipelines to Kashigar in China's western province, Xinjiang, instead of crossing the South China Sea, and which will significantly cut the transportation cost. And if I could have a little more time, and then I think that there would be 3 benefits that China can gain by pursuing a proactive energy investment strategy under BRI. And it, as I briefly mentioned, it could meet the demand of the Chinese domestic interests of energy security and overcapacities, especially coal that Luft has explained a lot, and the development of inland provinces. And it would be able to seek to promote its own image as a positive factor for economic development. So far, Chinese going out strategy to Africa and other regions has been somewhat shown very aggressive, and some people argue that there has been inclination to align with authoritarian government. But with this BRI initiative, China has become able to create more positive image with the neighboring countries. And thirdly, it could enhance geopolitical influence by establishing rules and regulations governing the trade and investment in the energy sector that are in line with Chinese economic interests. So I think that this is why the U.S. energy companies and other companies like Gal mentioned, Bechtel and other companies, it will be very important to raise the global standards with regard to these rules and regulations.
Great. Thanks very much, Miyeon. And now we want to raise some questions and dig a little deeper into some of the issues that were raised, and I certainly encourage the panel to ask each other questions as well. I might start by asking Gal. I mean, a big question for me is, like, in a nutshell, how's it going so far? I mean, where are we seeing a lot of projects moving forward? I had heard on the margins of UNGA in New York that Pakistani projects are going forward very rapidly. Where is it happening, and where do we see challenges? Boyden mentioned regulatory challenges in some of the advanced countries, but what's your take on, what's your assessment of progress to date would be my main question for you, Gal.
Well, the 2 issues here. One is what you read in the news. I don't want to say fake news or this, but even in China, when you look at the reports, you see that a lot of things have happened. But once you begin to drill down and look beyond the headlines, you see that a lot of things that have been reported as already fait accompli and that there was signed some MOU or something, that doesn't mean that it's already happening. So I would say that maybe 20% of what has been reported so far that has been done was done, and because there's a lot of problems with implementation, a lot of problems with execution, with financing, with so it will take much longer than many of us think. So we don't need to think that if the president of China and the president of another country met and made some statement, and the next day fast trains will run between the 2 capitals and so forth. It's a generational project, and it will take a long time. But what we've seen, some very important and in fact very unique acquisitions that have been made. For example, China, when it comes to oil, just recently a Chinese company bought 14% of Rosneft, the Russian national oil company. Before that, 12% of Abu Dhabi's national oil company were purchased, by the way, by the same company. So we've seen a lot of acquisitions of resources, state-owned resources, I would say. The government-to-government sort of approach. We are seeing a lot of movements in the financial sector, with the Chinese trying to acquire shares in financial institutions, not very successfully, I would say, because of the regulatory issues, but they're still trying. We're seeing also recalibration of the Chinese investment policy which directs investment from, I would say, more frivolous investment like football clubs and golf courses to things that are more in the so-called in the national interest. But overall, it seems to me that if you look at the acquisition and where the money is going towards distressed assets in Europe, for example, ports, for example, airports, for example, terminals, storage facilities for oil and natural gas. Less, I would say, in the space of rail, because rail projects are very, very expensive, especially if you go for high speed, and that requires much more effort financially. And also places, a lot of projects that have been agreed upon before the Belt and Road was even announced were folded into the Belt and Road. So we think that it's a Belt and Road, but those things have been happening anyway, even before this initiative was announced. So I would say a lot of things are happening. There's a lot of buzz, and China is very, very committed to this. This is a legacy project for Xi Jinping. That's his main imprint on the history of the world. But make no mistake, this is not a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan. This is a generational plan, and we'll have to. That's why it's so important the U.S. begins to engage now, before too much steel goes on the ground.
Thanks, Gal. If the panel has any comments on that, we'll go to you, or otherwise I'll keep asking questions and then soon turn to the audience. Yes, Ambassador Gray.
Well, one question which I think Gal knows about, because we cross paths in another context, is the question of the direction of energy development for pollution control, for climate change, for example, which has not yet been mentioned, but is sort of a hovering presence over everything. My question is, are these investments in oil facilities or looking towards more pipelines for oil, do they make sense if China is really going to execute its ban on internal combustion engines, which could have ripple effects, of course, across the world? And we see Europe preparing the same kinds of bans, all probably coming out of the Volkswagen mess with pollution control in this country. But if we are going to have bans on typical cars, is there a really huge, big oil future?
Well, I think that a lot of Chinese acquisitions on oil are not necessarily to supply oil to China. It's a common mistake that people make, that China is investing in oil because it's going to get this oil. Not necessarily. They are investing in oil because it's a good investment. And you know, when oil is at $50 and you assume that it will go up, then you want to buy it when it's cheap. And every time the price of oil goes down, we see another acquisition. So not all of the oil that they are buying will serve the Chinese economy. I think that they also put a huge emphasis on gas. They understand that gas is the next oil, natural gas that is, and they are heavily investing in gas infrastructure, gas storage, LNG, etc. Also electricity. If you want to have an electric future, then you need to think about the grid, how to create transnational grids, high voltage power lines, etc., etc. You know, if you want to run your cars on batteries, then you have to have a very strong and sophisticated grid. And nobody has such a grid today, but if you're really thinking about mass deployment of electric vehicles down the road, then you need to think about these issues today. And I think that we will need oil for as long as the eye can see. So certainly, especially since China's domestic oil production is in decline. So yes, they will need oil, but they are already looking beyond oil and investing accordingly.
Dr. Up?
And I would like to add that the renewable energy projects such as solar and wind have been promoted in Chinese media, as a benefit to these countries and evidence of China, and they're saying that they're following the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So one example would be the energy project in Pakistan. So it has coal project, as Carl mentioned, but then it has renewable energy and it has LNG, and we can also discuss the energy sources for transportation links. And I believe that is a Scowcroft fund, and then the one dimension that China is really aiming is to just get the transfer of the technological know-how. So that's why it just has a launch a project with German company. So there could be potential for collaboration in electronic vehicles or some kinds of alternative transportation technologies.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Oh. Let me take a look at the word cloud and pose a question. And for those of you who haven't yet voted, and I think by my count about half of you have voted, and we're not going to let you out until you vote. You can sign into menti.com with the code 261488. And I'm seeing a lot of positive things here, a lot of upside. I see China, obviously, opportunity, trade, influence, connectivity. These are all nice things. So I wanted to ask, though, I'm a former Pentagon official, and some of my colleagues are in the audience. I'm always focused. I'm always thinking about security and dark scenarios, and so I wanted to ask the group, sort of, we all see the upside, as we can tell from the word cloud, but what are the security implications of this? Gal and others. I mean, you mentioned in your strategy paper that there will be some security tensions that we need to continue to be sensitive to. But how might this play out? How is this infrastructure going to, and these investments going to be protected from non-state actors? Will they raise state tensions? And then I would imagine, too, with India, a major player, and perhaps the greatest growth in economic capacity over the next 50 years coming from India, from the projections that I've seen. You know, India and China in geopolitical tension, the US and India somewhat aligned, Japan playing a role. I think security questions come up from the state angle, too. So I would love to hear your views, Gal, but also the panels on the security aspects of this entire conversation.
Barry, I think that the way I look at infrastructure is sort of like, if you look at up until the 19th century, relations between countries were solidified via marriage. So if I wanted to have a nice relationship with a certain country, I would send my daughter to marry the leader of the other country, and we have one generation of peace and stability. That ended in World War I. But today, I think that what really defines or has the potential to define relationship between countries is infrastructure. If two countries get connected via pipeline, then you know that for the next 20 years or 30 years, they have common interest to keep the relations good because they are tied to each other. The future is tied, and the more economic interest there are, that affects the relationship. So I think from a security standpoint, what we will probably see is that more and more countries will be tied to China through infrastructure. And let us not forget that China borders on land 14 countries. There are 14 countries that are land neighbors of China. We all tend to focus always on the South China Sea, but we never talk about the fact that China has 14 countries on its border. And by the way, in most cases, those borders are very peaceful and stable, with the exception of recently with India, which was an Indian incursion, but even that ended without one bullet. So I think that from a security standpoint, what we will see is more and more countries dependent on their economic well-being on China, at land, but also at sea. And if you want to see what the future may look like, look at two countries, I think, that tell the story. One is the Philippines. Look what happened with the Philippines recently, how it gradually shifted from the US orbit to the Chinese orbit. And look at Thailand, another country that has recently made a shift. And that's because those countries need investment. Those countries need money. Money talks. money defines relationship. If you need money, if you need investment, you have to behave nicely to your banker. And I think that that is something you'll see across the board, increasingly in Europe, but not only in Europe. And the big question in my mind is how that will affect the Middle East, because China has not really made up its mind how it wants to see its Middle East strategy. That will be maybe a topic for another paper, but I think that's a very, very interesting question, how China will fit into this whole Middle East play.
Great points, Gal. And I want to turn to the audience very soon, so if you are, you have a question, please get my attention. Gal, I'm not sure I completely agree with the thought that the borders, land or maritime around China are calm. I mean, I think we have an enormous number of disputes and rather aggressive behavior by the PLA, in particular, but the PLA Navy, but we can set that one aside. And I think your broader point is important, that more and more countries are aligning themselves along the spectrum more toward China on major international issues and less towards their traditional postures. With that, please let me know if you have a question for the panelists. Yes, we'll go to this gentleman right here. If you can wait for the microphone and then identify yourself, that will be helpful.
Working? Yes. Thank you very much. My name is Yassi, and I'm a Rumsfeld Fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council. I agree absolutely with Gal that U.S.-Chinese relations needs more areas of cooperation. One of those areas that was not talked on today in this panel, and that given American presence and interest is crucially important, is Afghanistan. Given Chinese influence on Pakistan, who has played a brutal double game in Afghanistan over the past 17 years, don't you think President Trump, ahead of his visit to China, should be recommended to talk about Afghanistan and Pakistan's role in Afghanistan? Thank you.
So the question for the panel, for Gal, as well, is, what's the angle of Afghanistan and Pakistan? And how does that play in this recommended strategy for the United States?
Well, Pakistan is what China calls an all-weather friend. In fact, this is the most solid relationship and lasting relationship that China ever had. China does not have many traditional allies, but Pakistan, I would say, is maybe the number one of those, and that explains some of the commitments that China have made of over $60 billion already to the China-Pakistan economic corridor, etc. That said, on Afghanistan, I think the Chinese are a little bit more cautious. They don't think that they can succeed where Russia failed and the US so far failed. I think that they are very averse to get involved. They don't like to get involved in things that are high risk, and I would not count on them to play a meaningful role when it comes to the future of Afghanistan. I think they would prefer that the US take all the risk, and if there are rewards to reap down the road, I'm sure that they will try to get around the table at some point, but not when the risk is high.
Great. This lady right here.
Thank you. I'm Irene Shila. I come from Greece, and let's say in clash with Europe's interest in Southeast Europe? That's my question.
So, for those who didn't hear, how will China's significant investment in southeastern Europe in particular, we talked about the port of Piraeus, and I think with the United States and the transatlantic link as well. Ambassador Gray, I think that's a question high on your priority list.
Yes, well, that is one of the questions that I was trying to pose at the beginning. How does this all fit? One thing I should point out that Eastern Europe is, as I think Gal may have pointed out either verbally or in his paper, that Eastern Europe is often thought by the Russians as being their sphere of influence. So you may have, maybe not in Greece, but further north, you may have a collision of Russian and Chinese spheres of interest. How all this works out, I really do not know, but I do think that it is critical for the United States to help Europe finish its goals of integration. And by that I mean interlinking pipelines. I'm talking about all the aspects of integration, commercial, really more than political. It's very, very important for Europe to finish all that east-west for them, and for us to be part of that, so that when the China Road begins to get into Europe, as it did 2,000 years ago, we are there.
That gap, that sort of product, if it is financial assistance, be filled by other dynamic growing economies, potentially in the future, such as India?
Great question. So the first question was my understanding the coming, I believe this month, the Communist Party plenum, where most reports are suggesting that President Xi's power will grow very significantly, in some ways almost unprecedentedly, and how will that affect his vision and his initiative, which the Belt and Road Initiative is. And then the second question is, what China's investing in these countries, but what's to prevent India, other countries who have similar goods and capital, from also investing? So I turn that to our four panelists to take a shot at.
Should I start? I think that the internal process in China is extremely complicated, but no doubt that Xi Jinping will come out of this stronger. But I don't think that will have a major impact on the execution of the Belt and Road Initiative, because what drives all the politicians in China to support the Belt and Road is understanding that the distress of the banks and the distress of the all-powerful state-owned enterprises, if they're not happy, if they're not stable, then that's a problem for the Communist Party leadership. So they want to keep those guys fully employed, fully occupied, to enable them access to as many projects, because they know that the stability of the party, the regime, depends on the stability of the economy. So I think that that's a consensus across the board in the Chinese elite. And then the question is more of a nuance. Which provinces will benefit more? Because, China is not one country. You have three Chinas. You have what I call the $9,000 per capita GDP China, the $6,000 per capita GDP China, and the $3,000 per capita GDP China. And the more you move westward, the lower you get with the GDP capita. So then the question is, which province will benefit and how? We don't have time to go into this, but I think that will be the question. And the power struggle is not so much between the leaders of the party, but between the different governors and the party secretaries, the provincial secretaries, who's going to get a bigger chunk of the pie. With regards to other countries' investment, I think the Chinese welcome it. I think a very interesting thing to watch. Last month in September, there was a BRIC summit in Fujian province in China. And everybody was in anticipation to see whether Modi will join. Remember, that was at the time of great tension between China and India due to the border situation. Well, he showed up. And I think that tells you that even though he has a lot of reservations about China's encroachment on what is believed to be Indian sphere of influence, he still understands that it is in India's interest to be part of this story, and they are very interested in luring Japanese money and Korean money to advance some infrastructure projects of their choice and not have China draw the contour lines of the geopolitics of the region. But we have to be also very honest with ourselves and remember that infrastructure projects are not big money makers. You know, you don't make a lot of money out of infrastructure. The return on investment is not that great. When a lot of those investments that we even mentioned before, or the port of Piraeus and others, they were distressed assets. They were not making money. So China may have bought a bag of goods. Who knows? We'll see about that. But it's not that there was extremely profitable enterprises and China sort of scooped them. No, there were failing enterprises. There were money-losing enterprises, and China decided to take a bet on this and buy them. But you know, when you look at it from a pure financial standpoint, you have to ask yourself, is that a good investment? And in many cases, the answer is probably not.
And so I also would like to add that for the 19-party Congress, I believe that the BRI would still be the key policy and geodiplomatic agenda, because domestic stability and then economic development, those are two key agenda in terms of sustaining domestic politics for Xi Jinping. And so I believe that BRI is an answer to Chinese overcapacity problem. And although it is not able to solve out this problem in the short to medium term, but at least it can help Beijing buy time to enact further domestic reform and rebalancing. And we are talking about, so BRI, we have to understand in a way that this is a model of the economic development, and China is trying to transform the Chinese economic development model from manufacturing and export-driven growth to high domestic consumption. And with the prolonged economic slowdown, China really has to find a way. And another strategic point for BRI that I believe the Chinese government would like to just stick to it is because Chinese march westward, it would help avoid the direct confrontation with the United States and allies by directing Chinese own strategies. And I'd like to also just go back to your question on the access point, and then I believe that it can be related to your question. So what we're talking about here is about large-scale infrastructure development, which could lock in two countries or more than, multiple countries for the long-term contract. So for example, if you would like to build oil and natural gas pipelines, and usually the pipeline lasts for 30 years. So and that's why we can also talk about the high-speed railways. So maybe that's why U.S. so far doesn't have that long-term infrastructure project with China, but while Georgia does. So maybe that could be the access point where other countries have more, but the United States haven't. So I believe that this is where the U.S. private company could play a more role than before.
Thanks very much. I think we have time for one more question maybe, or a couple quick ones. Yes, in the back. We'll take that one.
Hi, thank you for the panel. It's very important, I think. My name is Greg Smith. I'm in the U.S. Navy. My question, in light of seems like two sides of a coin here, How do we incentivize U.S. investment in some of these projects to compete with China along the BRI? And at the same time, how do we get U.S. businesses the truth about the infrastructure in light of the propaganda and the heavy push by China?
I think that's a wonderful question that needs to be raised in the context of the meeting between President Trump and President Xi. Because what we want to make sure is that there is a higher degree of fairness when it comes to business relationship, whether it is directly with Chinese companies or as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. First of all, I think the United States should insist on equal opportunity for its companies, not to be discriminated against, not to have share IP or data or all kind of things, and also to make sure that the Chinese side has to comply with the same legal restrictions when it comes to transparency, when it comes to environmental standards, when it comes to supply chain, etc. So, you know, if there's one area where I think a political echelon needs to focus in their dialogue with China when it comes to those issues is on the fairness issue, on the ability of American corporations to play a constructive role in this initiative and make money, because unlike state-owned enterprises in China, American companies will only come in if they think that they can make money. They're not agents of the state. So they will have to look at the project as a moneymaker. And therefore, the only way that they can compete is if the playing field is even. And I think that's where the details need to be fleshed out. How do you create an even playing field? Because don't forget that even with the other neighboring countries, or the countries that are on the receiving end of Belt and Road project, most of their companies are also state-owned. So it's state-owned talking to state-owned, and then the question is, where is the private sector in this? And the good news is that this initiative cannot succeed solely on sovereign money. It needs private capital. And if the Chinese will not know how to attract private capital, this initiative will not succeed. And they know it, by the way, and they know it.
Thanks very much, Boyden. I think, unfortunately, we're out of time. But I think I'm a believer in the wisdom of crowds, and when I look at the biggest words on how this audience has voted, I think we can see very easily that influence, opportunity, and trade are really the main things to watch as this unfolds over the next several decades. And if you look back at relatively recent history, I think the Marshall Plan is the equivalent I use in my mind. Lots of distinctions, but also some similarities. And if you look at the key results of that effort, significant period, decades of peace and major economic capacity unleashed through that effort. I think if you fast forward to 2040, 2050 and look back, you're going to see a very similar story, and the U.S. has to play in that story. That's really going to be a major part of global economic growth over the next 30, 40 years. And so I think how the United States plays, both public and private sector actors with allies and partners in Asia and Europe and elsewhere, is really something that the Atlantic Council is going to watch very closely, and we would love and appreciate your thoughts as we go forward. Please join me in thanking a really excellent set of panelists today.